everyone, today we are going to solve the daily LeetCode challenge of 7th April 2024 and the problem statement is valid parenthesis string. So let us first understand the problem statement. So according to the problem statement, we have been given a string S such that it contains opening bracket, closing bracket and asterisk. Okay. Now we have to determine whether this string S is a valid parenthesis string or not. Now what is a valid parenthesis string? So a valid parenthesis string is a string in which for each opening bracket, there exists a closing bracket. And for every closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket. Then we will say that it is a valid parenthesis string. Now let's take an example. If I'll ask you that, is this a valid parenthesis string? So you will say yes. Why? Because we can see that for this opening bracket, we have this closing bracket. And for this opening bracket, we have this closing bracket. So all the parentheses are forming a valid pair, correct? So we will say that this is a valid parenthesis string. Now, if I'll ask you, is this the valid parenthesis string? You will say no. Why? Because we can see that for this opening bracket, we have this closing bracket, correct? But for this particular opening bracket, there is no closing bracket, right? So it means that this is not forming a valid parenthesis string, correct? Similarly, if I'll ask you, is this a valid parenthesis string? You will say no. Why? Because for this particular closing bracket, there is no opening bracket, right? And similarly, for this opening bracket, there is no closing bracket. So this is not a valid parenthesis string. Fine. Now we have understood what is a parenthesis string. Now, according to the question, they have mentioned that the asterisk which they have given, we can treat it as an opening bracket or as a closing bracket or as an empty string, correct? Now, let's see what does it mean. It means that if I'll give you something like this and I'll ask you, is this a valid parenthesis string? So you will say yes. Now, let us understand why. So we can see that we have an opening bracket, correct? Now, for this particular string to be a valid parenthesis string, what do we need? We need a closing bracket, correct? Because we have the opening bracket, but we don't have a closing bracket. So what we will do is, we will treat this particular asterisk as a closing bracket. So if we will treat it as a closing bracket, then what we will have? We will have an opening bracket and a closing bracket. So we can see that these two are forming a valid pair of parentheses. So we will say that yes, this is a valid parenthesis string. And what we did is we treated this particular asterisk as a closing bracket over here, correct? Similarly, if I ask you, is this a valid parenthesis string? You'll say yes. Why? Because we can see that we have a closing bracket, correct? And for this particular string to be a valid parenthesis string, what do we want? We want an opening bracket, correct? We want an opening bracket. So what we will do is we will treat this particular asterisk as an opening bracket, correct? And what we will do, so if this is an opening bracket, so what does it mean? We have an opening bracket, we have a closing bracket. So these two are forming a valid pair of parentheses and hence it is a valid parenthesis string, correct? Now, if I'll have something like this and I'll ask you, is this a valid parenthesis string? You'll say yes. Why? Because we can see for this particular opening bracket, we have this closing bracket, correct? So these two are already forming a valid pair of parentheses. So we don't want to treat this particular asterisk as any of the parentheses, right? I don't want to treat it as an opening bracket or as a closing bracket. So what we will do, we will simply treat it as an empty string. So if we will treat it as an empty string, then we can see that, okay, we have opening bracket, we have closing bracket and it's forming a valid parenthesis string. Fine. Now that we have understood the problem statement, now let's see how we are going to solve it. So let's first determine whether this string S is a valid parenthesis string or not, correct? So we have an opening bracket, so we have an opening bracket. After that, we again have an opening bracket. Then we have a closing bracket, so we have a closing bracket. Now we can see that this opening bracket and this closing bracket are forming a valid pair of parentheses, correct? So let's remove them as of now because we have got their valid pairs, correct? Now, after that, we have a asterisk. So we can write this asterisk over here. And then we have a closing bracket. And then we again have a closing bracket. Correct. Now we can see that this particular opening bracket and this particular closing bracket, we can say that these two are forming a valid pair of parentheses. Correct. But for this particular closing bracket, we don't have any opening bracket. So what we will do is we will treat this asterisk as an opening bracket. So if we will make it as an opening bracket, then what will happen? Then we'll see that for this opening bracket, we have this as closing bracket and these two are forming a valid pair. So let's remove them. And this one is also forming a valid pair. So let's remove them as well. Correct? So what we have got? We have got that this is a valid parenthesis string. Why? We can see that these two are forming a valid pair of parentheses and we can treat this asterisk as a opening bracket. So these two are also forming a valid pair of parentheses and these two are also forming a valid pair of parentheses. So this particular string S is a valid parenthesis string. Correct? So we know one thing. We know that in order to solve this problem, we need to keep track of the count of the opening bracket, the closing bracket, and the asterisk. Why? Because we want to know that how many opening brackets are present over here. If the count of opening bracket is comparatively greater than the count of closing bracket, then we can say that this is not a valid parenthesis string. Correct? But if we will have the count of opening bracket over here as 3 and closing bracket over here as 1, and we can see if we have 2 asterisk over here, then what we can do? We can treat these 2 asterisk as 2 closing bracket, and we'll say that this is a valid parenthesis string. So that's the reason why we also need to keep track of the count of the A string, correct? So what we will do is we'll make use of 2 pointers in order to solve this problem, and basically we will keep track of the count of the opening bracket and the closing bracket. So let's see how we will do it. So what we will do is we will take 2 variables, open which would be initially 0 and close which would also be initially 0. Now what this open will do is this open will keep track of the count of the opening brackets along with the asterisk. Now you'll ask that why are we counting this asterisk as an opening bracket? Because there could be a possibility in which we will have to treat this asterisk as an opening bracket, correct? Similarly, this close will keep track of the count of the closing bracket and the count of asterisk. Now, why the count of asterisk? Because we can have a case like this in which we will have to treat this asterisk as a closing bracket, correct? So that's the reason why calculating the opening bracket and the closing bracket, what we will do is we will count the opening and the closing bracket along with the count of the asterisk, correct? So what we will do, let's first find out the count of the opening bracket, correct? So initially we are over here. So we have got an opening bracket. So what we will do, we will increment the count of the opening bracket, fine. Now we will move ahead. Now again we have got an opening bracket. What we will do, we will increment the count of the opening bracket. So the opening bracket count is 2. Now we will move ahead. Now we have got a closing bracket, correct? And we can see that our opening bracket count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that before this closing bracket, we have encountered some opening bracket. So what could be possible is this particular closing bracket can form a valid pair of parentheses with that opening bracket, correct? So it means that for this particular closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket. So what we will do is, since these two will form a valid pair of parentheses, we will decrement the count from over here because we have used this particular opening bracket in order to form a valid pair with this closing bracket, correct? So what we will get as the count? We will get the count of opening bracket as 1. So now we understood that what we will do, we will move forward in order to calculate the count of open bracket, that is the count of open bracket and the count of asterisk, correct? And whenever we will encounter a closing bracket, what we will do, we will decrement the count of the opening bracket, fine? Now we will move forward. Now we have got an asterisk. So what we will do, we will treat this asterisk as an opening bracket and we will increment the count of the opening bracket. So we will get the opening bracket as 2, fine? Now we'll move forward again. So we have found out a closing bracket. Since we have encountered a closing bracket, we will check is our opening bracket count 0. So we can see that opening bracket count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that for this particular closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket with which it can form a valid pair of parentheses, correct? Now you may ask that why I am marking this one as an opening bracket, because while calculating the count of opening bracket, we treated this asterisk as an opening bracket, right? So we can say that these two are forming a valid pair of parentheses, and since this is contributing to form a valid pair of parentheses, we'll decrement the count by 1. So what we will get? We'll get 1. Okay. We'll move forward. Now again we have encountered a closing bracket. So we'll check is our opening bracket count 0. So we can see that opening bracket count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that for this particular closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket with which it can form a valid pair of parentheses. And since it can form a valid pair of parentheses with it, what we will do? We will decrement 1. Because it had this particular opening bracket had formed a valid pair of parentheses with this closing bracket, correct? And we'll get the open bracket count as 0 and we'll move forward. So we can see that we have completely exhausted the particular string S. So it means that till now we have calculated the open bracket count and the asterisk count, and whenever we encountered the closing bracket, what we did, we checked whether the opening bracket count is 0 or not and we decremented it, correct? Now we will find out the count of closed bracket. So while finding out the count of closed bracket, what we will include? We will include the closing bracket and the asterisk symbol, correct? So we are present over here. So we'll check. Is this a closing bracket? So this is a closing bracket. So what we will do? We will increment the count of the closing bracket. So it will become 1 and we'll move backward. Now again, we have encountered a closing bracket. So we'll increment its count. So it will become 2. And we'll move backward. Now we have encountered a asterisk. So what we will do, we will treat this particular asterisk as a closing bracket and we will increment the count of the closing bracket and we will move backward. Now we have encountered a closing bracket again. So what we will do, we will increment the count of the close. So it will become 4. Fine. Now we'll move backward. Now we have encountered a opening bracket. Now we will check whether the close count is 0 or not. So we can see that the close count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that for this particular opening bracket, there exists a closing bracket with which it can form a valid pair of parentheses. And since this closing bracket will form a valid pair of parentheses with this opening bracket, so what we will do? We will decrement 1 from here and we'll get 3. And we'll move backward. again we can see that we have found out an opening bracket. Now we'll check, is the close count 0? So we can see that close count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that for this particular opening bracket, there exists a closing bracket with which it can form a valid pair of parentheses, correct? And since this particular closing bracket is forming a valid pair of parentheses with this opening bracket, what we will do is, we will decrement the count of close by 1, and what we will get? We will get 2 over here, correct? And what we will do, we'll move backward. And we can see that we have completely processed all the elements of S. And what we have got, we can see that while processing these values, we didn't found anywhere that open became 0 or close became 0. And we were still having a closing bracket over here or an opening bracket over here. So we will return true. Now let's handle an invalid case so that it becomes clear to you all. Now let's say if this is the given string to us. Okay, so what we will do, we'll first of all find out the count of opening bracket. So we can see this is an opening bracket, we will increment open count, we'll move forward. This is an opening bracket, we'll increment open count and move forward. Now we have encountered a closing bracket. Now we'll check whether for this closing bracket there exists an opening bracket or not. So we can see that open count is not 0. Then what does it mean? It means that for this particular closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket. So what we will do is, we will decrement the count of open by 1 because we have found out a valid pair, correct? So what we'll do, we'll get 1 over here. Fine, we'll move forward. Now we have found out an asterisk. So what we'll do, we'll treat it as an opening bracket and we'll increment the count. So it will become 2. Now we have found a closing bracket. We'll check whether for this closing bracket, we have an opening bracket or not. So we can see that for this particular closing bracket, we have an opening bracket. Why? Because we can see that open count is not 0. So it means that we have an opening bracket for this closing bracket, correct? With which it can form a valid pair of parentheses. So what we will do, we'll decrement the count by 1 because this particular opening bracket will be forming a valid pair with this one, right? So we'll get 1 over here and we'll move forward. We can see we have got a closing bracket. So we'll check, is our open count 0? So open count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means for this closing bracket, we have an opening bracket, correct, with which it's forming a valid pair of parentheses. So what we will do, we'll decrement 1 over here because this opening bracket is forming a valid pair with this one, right? And we'll get a 0. And we'll move forward. Now we can see we have got a closing bracket. So we'll check whether an opening bracket exists for this one. So we can see that open count is 0. So what does it mean? It means that for this particular closing bracket, we don't have any opening bracket. Additionally, we can see that this is an opening bracket, this is a closing bracket. These two are forming a valid pair, correct? For this closing bracket, this is the opening bracket and these two are forming a valid pair. For this closing bracket, this is the opening bracket and these two are forming a valid pair. But for this particular closing bracket, we don't have any opening bracket, correct? So whenever we will encounter a closing bracket and at that very moment our open count would be 0, then what does it mean? It simply means that for this closing bracket, we don't have any opening bracket and it simply means that this is not a valid parenthesis string. So what we will do? We'll return false from here and we don't have to check the close count at that very moment. Why? Because we already know that this is invalid because for this closing bracket, we don't have an opening bracket, right? Similarly, when we will calculate a close count, okay. So say for example, if we have an example like this. Okay, when we will find out the count of close bracket, correct? So what we will do when we are over here, we'll say that, okay, we have got a closing bracket. So what we'll do, we'll increment the count of close. Fine. Now we are over here. So we'll say that we have found out an opening bracket. So what we will do, we will first check whether our close is 0 or not. So close is not 0. So what does it mean? It means for this opening bracket, there exists a closing bracket and it is forming a valid pair with it. And since it's forming a valid pair with it, what we will do is we will decrement 1 from over here and we'll get a 0 and we'll move backward. Now we can see that again we have encountered an opening bracket. Now we'll check, is our close count 0? So we can see that close count is 0. So what does it mean? It means that for this particular opening bracket, we don't have any closing bracket. And since we don't have any closing bracket, so what does it mean? It means that this is not a valid parenthesis string. So from here we'll return a false. So what we did is we firstly took two variables open and close and we started iterating from left to right for calculating the count of open parentheses. And whenever we'll encounter open parenthesis on an asterisk, what we will do, we'll increment the count of open bracket. And whenever we'll found a closing bracket, what we will do, we will check that whether our open count is 0 or not. If our open count is 0, what we'll do, we'll return false. Why? Because if we'll encounter a closing bracket and our open count is 0, then what does it mean? It means that for this particular closing bracket, we don't have an opening bracket. Fine. So we'll simply return false, indicating that this is not a valid parenthesis string, correct? But if we have processed the entire string S and we have found out that while processing it, we never encountered the false state, that we never encountered that we have found out a closing bracket and the open bracket count was 0. So what does it mean? It means that for every closing bracket, we are having an opening bracket. Now, what do we want to check? We want to check that for every opening bracket, does there exist a closing bracket? And how are we going to do that? We are going to do that by counting the close, right? So how we are counting the close? We will be moving from right to left, and we'll say that whenever we'll encounter a closing bracket or an asterisk, we'll increment the close count. And whenever we'll encounter a opening bracket, we'll check, is the close 0? If close is 0 and we have encountered an opening bracket, what we'll do? We'll return false. Why? Because it simply means that we don't have any closing bracket for this opening bracket, right? Like in this case, we found out that when we were over here, we didn't had any closing bracket because the close count was 0. So it simply means that we don't have any closing bracket. So this particular opening bracket can't form a valid pair, right? So since it can't form a valid pair with a closing bracket, so what does it mean? It means that this is an invalid parenthesis string and will simply return false, correct? Now I hope the solution is clear to you all. So let's quickly code this. So initially we'll take two variable, open, which would be initially 0, and the another variable would be close, which would be initially 0 as well. So first of all, we'll validate whether for every closing bracket there exists an opening bracket or not, correct? And how are we doing that? We'll first iterate over the string x. So we'll say index equals to 0, index less than s dot size, index plus plus. What we'll do, we'll say that if our s of index is an opening bracket or if s of index is a asterisk. So in that case, what we'll do, we will treat it as an opening bracket and we'll increment the count of open, correct? Else, if we find out that it's not an opening bracket, it's a closing bracket, then what we need to check? We need to check that if our open count is 0 or not, correct? Now, if our open count is 0 and we have encountered a closing bracket, then what does it mean? It means that for that particular closing bracket, there does not exist any opening bracket, right? So it simply means that it is an invalid parenthesis string. So what we will do from here, we'll simply return a false, correct? Otherwise, what we can have? Otherwise, we can have that we have encountered a closing bracket and the opening bracket count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that for that particular closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket with which it can form a valid pair. So since that particular opening bracket is contributing in order to form a valid pair with the closing bracket, so what we will do, we'll decrement the count of open, correct? And now when we will come out of this for loop, what we have validated that for every closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket. Now, what do we need to validate? Now we need to validate that for every opening bracket, there exists a closing bracket. And how are we going to do that? We will be iterating over the given string s starting from its end. So we'll say index equals to s dot size, index greater than equal to 0, index minus minus. What we'll say is, if we have got s of index as a closing bracket, or if s of index is an asterisk, then what we will do? Then we will treat this asterisk as this and this closing bracket as a closing bracket and we'll increment close count, correct? Otherwise, what could be possible? Otherwise, it could be possible that we have encountered an opening bracket. So when we will encounter an opening bracket, first of all, what we need to check? We need to check, is this close count 0? So if we have encountered an opening bracket and the close count is 0, so what does it mean? It means that for that particular opening bracket, we don't have any closing bracket, right? And since for that opening bracket, we don't have any closing bracket, so it simply means that it can't form a valid pair of parentheses with any closing bracket, right? Since we don't have any closing bracket. So what we'll do, we'll simply return false from over here, correct? Else what could be possible? Else it could be possible that we have found out the opening bracket and the closing bracket count is not 0. So what does it mean? It means that a particular closing bracket can form a valid pair of parentheses with that opening bracket. So what we will do, since it is forming a valid pair with that opening bracket, we'll decrement the count of close, correct? Now, whenever we come out of this for loop, what does it mean? It means that we have validated that for every opening bracket, there is a closing bracket or not, correct? And if we won't get a false from here, and if we won't get a false from here, then what does it mean? It means that for every closing bracket, there exists an opening bracket. And similarly, for every opening bracket, there exists a closing bracket. So what does it mean? It means that it is a valid parenthesis string, correct? So if it is a valid parenthesis string, what we will do, we'll simply return true from here, correct? Now let's quickly run this. So it's giving us the correct answer. Let's submit it. And it got accepted. Now talking about the time complexity and space complexity. So if we consider the size of the given string s as n, then the total time complexity would be order of n. Let's see how. So what we are doing over here? Over here, we are iterating over the entire string s from left to right in order to validate whether for every closing bracket there exists an opening bracket or not. So what we will be doing over here? We will be processing all the n elements of the string s, correct? So this is going to cost us a time complexity of order of n, correct? Similarly, over here, what we are doing, we are iterating over the entire string S in order to validate whether for every opening bracket there exists a closing bracket or not, correct? So it means that over here, again, we will be iterating over all the n elements of string S, correct? So it means that the total time complexity would be order of n plus order of n, which is order of 2n. And since 2 is the constant, we can ignore it and we'll ultimately get the time complexity as order of n only, correct? And talking about the space complexity, so we can see that we are not using any extra space from our end, correct? Since we are not using any extra space from our end, so the space complexity would be order of 1. So that's all about today's daily LeetCode challenge. Thank you.